Welcome to the Sleepy Terminal. Tonight, we'll embark on a quiet, reflective journey through the history of one of computing's most humble companions, the floppy disk. You may remember holding one in your hands, or perhaps you've only seen one as an icon, small, square, and labeled Save. Wherever your starting point, this story is one that flows gently through time, calm, measured, and wrapped in a faint, magnetic hum. This video isn't here to startle or impress, it's here to soothe. We'll move slowly through 5 decades of evolution, not rushing to conclusions or dazzling with specs. Just a peaceful unfolding of how a simple storage device helps shape the digital world. Whether you're listening to fall asleep, to unwind, or to indulge in quiet nostalgia, you're in good company. The floppy disk wasn't flashy, it didn't boast blistering speeds or breathtaking capacity, but for a long stretch of time, it was essential. A companion to students finishing essays, a tool for office workers saving quarterly reports, a vessel for game saves, driver updates, digital photos, and tiny personal programs. It was useful, it was familiar, and it was everywhere. In a time before USB drives, before cloud sync, and long before Wi-Fi connected everything, there was the floppy. And it asked very little of us. Just a gentle insertion, a satisfying click, and the soft spin of plastic reading tiny, magnetized bits of memory. Tonight, we'll explore this story in 6 slow-moving chapters, from the birth of the 8-inch floppy in the halls of IBM, to its 5.25-inch cousin that brought computing into homes, to the small but mighty 3.5-inch disk that found its way into backpacks, office drawers, and video game boxes across the world. We'll walk through how it worked, what it held, and why it mattered. There will be no urgency here, no suspense, only the quiet rhythm of a changing world, told through a once ordinary object. And by the end, we'll understand not just how floppy disks worked, but how they made computing feel tangible. Slower, yes, but also more deliberate, more human. So if you're ready, make yourself comfortable. Dim the lights, let your breathing soften, and allow this slow, meditative stroll through digital history to carry you through the folds of memory and time. Let's begin. In the late 1960s, computing was a vastly different landscape. Machines filled rooms, buzzed with static electricity, and operated in a language of blinking lights, punch cards, and reams of magnetic tape. These systems were powerful for their time, but lacked the one thing modern users take for granted: portability. If you wanted to move data from one machine to another, it required careful planning, bulky media, and often human intervention with carts and cables. At the forefront of innovation, IBM was seeking a simpler way to load microcode into their System 370 mainframe computers. What they envisioned was something slim, reusable, and portable, a data carrier that engineers could load with essential firmware or diagnostics and carry in one hand. The answer came in the form of the 8-inch floppy disk, developed by a team led by Alan Shugart in 1971. This new diskette was unlike anything before. It was soft, flexible, and magnetic, a thin film inside a square paper-like sleeve. The first models were read-only, capable of holding around 80 kilobytes of data, but that was revolutionary for the time. IBM's initial application involved updating system firmware, but the potential was quickly realized by other industries. Here was a medium that could be mass-produced, reused, and easily transported. The disk's construction was a feat of minimalist engineering. A polyester sheet coated with iron oxide spun inside a protective envelope. Data was stored on concentric circular tracks and accessed sequentially by a mechanical drive head. While slow and fragile by today's standards, the technology represented a new tier of convenience. By the mid-1970s, writable versions became available, expanding the floppy's utility. Now users could store their own files, programs, records, logs, and take them from one system to another. This shift marked the early phase of truly personalized computing. In corporate settings, large-scale mini-computers began to adopt floppy disks for file exchange and software distribution. A financial analyst in one office could save a program on a disk and hand it to a colleague across the hall or across town. Universities used them to transfer datasets between labs. Businesses included software updates on floppies mailed to clients. Slowly, the idea of bringing your data with you was taking shape. The 8-inch floppy became a symbol of technical capability. Though it required careful storage, Flat drawers, plastic sleeves, and cool rooms, it offered freedom. You no longer had to rely solely on a single machine's local storage. And while network computing was still years away for the average user, floppies bridged the gap between isolated machines. Even the drives themselves had an aesthetic. Large, clunky bays with mechanical doors that slid open and closed with a satisfying thunk. Loading a disk felt ceremonial. Lining up the corner notch, feeling its seat, and watching the drive light flicker as it spun to life. For a time, entire software suites fit on just one or two floppies. Word processors, accounting tools, and scientific programs were distributed to businesses and institutions this way. Developers began optimizing code to work within the constraints of the format, encouraging elegant, efficient design. Though the general public was still a few years away from widespread floppy usage, the groundwork was being laid. Magazines and trade publications began advertising drives and disks. Early hobbyists experimented with integrating floppy drives into homebrew computing systems, eager to escape the tedium of cassette tapes or punch paper. As competitors entered the market, new variations emerged. Some improved durability, others increased capacity, but the 8-inch standard held for much of the decade. The format eventually supported up to 1.2 megabytes of data, but its physical size and delicacy made it impractical for personal computing, which was on the horizon. IBM's influence played a critical role. Because of its widespread adoption of the floppy format, many third-party manufacturers followed suit. Standards began to coalesce around disk geometry, track layout, and drive interface protocols. This cooperation laid the groundwork for a more unified ecosystem, reducing compatibility headaches. The 8-inch floppy also catalyzed early debates in data security. Because disks were removable, they could be stolen, lost, or copied, prompting IT departments to develop early access controls and policies for sensitive files. For the first time, digital information could be treated like a physical asset, something that could be locked in a drawer or handed over with a handshake. This portability shifted not just how data moved, but how people thought about data itself. You didn't need to be physically near a mainframe to work with your files. You could write your program in one room, test it in another, and archive it in a third. The floppy gave data legs, and with it, users discovered mobility. Trade shows in the late 70s featured floppy drives alongside the latest computing advancements. Demonstrations highlighted their versatility. Visitors would walk away with promotional discs containing demos, slideshows, or marketing brochures, a precursor to the USB giveaways of decades later. The presence of floppy disks in business culture was striking. Executives carried them to meetings. Secretaries filed them alongside client folders. Some companies printed branded labels or shipped software on colorful, company-themed disks. They weren't just storage, they were messaging. In academic research, floppies helped accelerate the sharing of ideas. Professors exchanged data sets with colleagues across institutions. Students handed in assignments saved to a disk. Research labs archived early findings, preserving digital trails for later review. These weren't isolated occurrences. They were becoming the new normal. By the end of the 1970s, the floppy disk had solidified its place as a practical necessity. It was no longer a novelty. It was an expectation. Workflows evolved around it. Teams were structured to support it. Documentation assumed it. The floppy was here to stay, at least for a while. In many ways, it represented a democratization of computing. No longer chained to large and mobile tape systems or fragile card decks, users could finally interact with their computers in a more fluid, intuitive manner. File access became tactile. Updates became manageable. And the idea of saving your work, retrieving it later, and sharing it with others became second nature. The floppy disk's true genius wasn't in its capacity or its speed. It was in its simplicity. A thin circle of magnetized plastic spinning quietly in a box changed how we thought about computing, not as a stationary process, but as something you could carry with you. And so, with reverence, we close this first chapter, having met the floppy at its beginning, unassuming, experimental, and ready to carry the future in its soft, spinning core. As the 1980s dawned, computing was moving from laboratories and corporate back offices into homes, classrooms, and small businesses. The bulky 8-inch floppy, while groundbreaking, was too large and expensive for the needs of personal computing. Enter the 5.25-inch floppy disk, a more compact and accessible storage medium that would become a defining symbol of the early PC era. The 5.25-inch floppy was introduced in 1976 by Shugart Associates, the company founded by Alan Shugart after his departure from IBM. The disk was a scaled-down version of the 8-inch predecessor, retaining its soft, flexible build, but offering greater portability. The initial storage capacity was modest, just 110 kilobytes, but as the format evolved, double-sided and double-density versions could hold up to 1.2 megabytes. What made the 5.25-inch disk so transformative wasn't just its size, it was its timing. The format emerged just as microcomputers were taking off. Machines like the Apple II, Commodore PET, TRS-80, and IBM PC all used 5.25-inch floppy drives. The disks were inexpensive to manufacture, simple to operate, and, most importantly, they felt approachable to the average consumer. Handling a floppy disk in this era became a familiar routine. Users would gently remove a disk from its paper sleeve, avoiding fingerprints on the exposed magnetic surface. Labels were handwritten: DOS boot, math homework, Space Invaders. These disks were personal, often decorated with doodles or color-coded stickers. Small, plastic storage boxes lined desks and bookshelves, filled with rows of carefully cataloged diskettes. The drives themselves were simple and mechanical. To use one, you'd slide the disk into a horizontal slot, then flip a lever or push a button to lock it in place. The whir of the motor and the faint click of the read head became part of the soundscape of home computing. It was analog in its charm. Each action had a tactile, audible confirmation. During this time, software distribution also underwent a transformation. Entire programs, operating systems, and games were shipped on floppies, sometimes as few as one, other times in sets of 5 or 10. Insert disk 2 to continue became a familiar instruction. Users developed patience and a process: organize disks in order, store backups, protect the magnetic surface, and always label clearly. For many, the 5.25-inch floppy was their first experience with saving and managing digital files. Students learned file structure by necessity. Parents helped their children store homework assignments. Teachers passed along educational software. And gamers eagerly swapped diskettes filled with pixelated adventures and MIDI soundtracks. Businesses embraced the format as well. Office workers saved spreadsheets, mailing lists, and word processing documents. Interoffice communication sometimes meant handing off a floppy with a sticky note attached. Advertising agencies sent creative drafts via disk. Floppy disks became extensions of our work lives, both tools and carriers. Beyond functionality, the format took on symbolic meaning. It represented digital independence. You no longer had to rely solely on institutional or corporate systems to store and access data. With a few disks and a personal computer, you could create, save, duplicate, and share content on your own terms. The limitations of the format were evident, but they also taught discipline. With less than 1.2 megabytes to work with, users became intentional. Files were compact. Extraneous data was deleted. Software developers wrote lean code. The entire ecosystem operated under constraints, and those constraints encouraged creativity and efficiency. As personal computing exploded, so too did the demand for floppies. Retailers sold them in bulk, packs of 10, 20, even 100. They came in a rainbow of colors, from matte black and navy blue to bright orange and pastel pink. Some companies offered pre-labeled disks for specific software or tasks. Others provided writable disks with metallic stickers that could be typed on with a typewriter or dot matrix printer. Educational publishers saw the potential as well. Interactive programs for typing, math drills, geography quizzes, and early word processors were all delivered via floppy. The disk became a gateway to learning. Children navigated menus and directories, unknowingly gaining early digital fluency. As more homes adopted personal computers, floppies became a form of social currency. Friends exchanged games, school projects, and even custom-created content. Bulletin board systems, BBS, and early shareware communities relied heavily on disk distribution. A single floppy might carry a pixel art program from California to Quebec through a chain of friends and mail envelopes. Security also evolved alongside the format. Write Protect notches, a small gap in the disk's casing, could be covered with a sticker to prevent accidental erasure. Users learned to check the notch before storing sensitive data. Some even taped over it for peace of mind. Despite its widespread popularity, the 5.25-inch disc was not without problems. It was fragile. Bending or creasing could render it unreadable. Exposure to dust, magnets, or sunlight could wipe data. Drives sometimes misaligned or failed to mount the disk properly, and data corruption, while uncommon, was never entirely out of the question. Still, these quirks became part of the computing experience. There was a ritual to disk usage, removing it carefully, storing it properly, testing it after saving. Users developed habits of mindfulness. "Did you save your file?" became a frequent, almost parental refrain. By the mid to late 1980s, high-density versions of the 5.25-inch disk extended its life. Some could hold over a megabyte of data, enough for more sophisticated applications and larger file storage. But change was on the horizon. A newer, sturdier, and smaller disk format was about to enter the scene. The arrival of the 3.5-inch floppy would eventually push the 5.25-inch disk into obsolescence. It offered a hard plastic shell, greater durability, and easier portability. But even as it faded, the 5.25-inch disk retained its place in memory. For many, it represented the golden age of personal computing, the first time they interacted with a machine that responded, stored, and remembered. So as we close this chapter, picture a classroom or living room in 1983. A beige desktop hums softly. A child sits cross-legged, carefully inserting a floppy-marked Reader Rabbit. Somewhere in a nearby office, an executive saves the quarterly report. A teacher prepares tomorrow's lesson plan. All of them, in their own quiet way, connected by a thin magnetic disk and the promise of accessible computing. The 5.25-inch floppy may not have had the sleekness of modern storage, but it offered something else: familiarity, reliability, and a tangible link between human intention and machine memory. As the 1980s gave way to the 1990s, the world of computing was evolving rapidly. Personal computers were becoming more powerful and more prevalent. Laptops were emerging. Offices were increasingly digitized. And with all of this advancement came a need for a more durable, compact, and higher capacity storage medium. That answer arrived in the form of the 3.5-inch floppy disk, a format that would become iconic. Sony introduced the 3.5-inch floppy disk in 1981, though it wouldn't gain widespread adoption until a few years later. It featured a hard plastic shell and a sliding metal shutter that protected the magnetic disk inside. This made it far more durable than its predecessor, the 5.25-inch floppy, which was prone to warping and damage from casual handling. You could toss a 3.5-inch disk into a backpack without fear, and it would likely survive the journey. The original versions of the 3.5-inch disk held 720 kilobytes of data, double-sided and double density. Later, high-density HD models offered 1.44 megabytes, a capacity that felt spacious at the time. Eventually, extended-density ED versions with 2.8 megabytes were introduced, though they remained relatively rare. The 1.44 megabyte disk became the de facto standard for nearly 2 decades. The smaller size of the 3.5-inch disk made it especially appealing for use with increasingly compact computer hardware. Laptops, then in their infancy, could accommodate the disks more easily. Desktop systems adopted them quickly. And for software developers, the format provided a better canvas for delivering their creations. In daily use, the 3.5-inch disk was a joy to handle. Its firm plastic build gave it a satisfying weight. The metal shutter clicked open when inserted into a drive and snapped shut when removed. It was easier to carry, easier to label, and far more durable than any floppy disk that came before it. People used these disks for everything. Students saved school reports and college applications. Office workers kept financial reports, presentation files, and important documentation. Gamers stored save files and shared levels and mods. Musicians and designers moved their work between home and studio. In a world before USB flash drives and cloud storage, the 3.5-inch floppy was the portable drive. The software industry leaned into the new format. Major operating systems were distributed on disks, often in large stacks labeled Disk 1 through Disk 10 or more. Installing programs became an exercise in patience, as users fed one disk after another into the drive. Yet this process became part of the computing ritual. Manufacturers and developers began shipping branded disks, some with custom-colored shells or labels adorned with logos. Promotional software, demo games, and subscription utilities arrived by mail. Computer magazines sometimes included floppies with sample programs, tools, or game trials. Just as with earlier floppy formats, users formed attachments to their disks. Many had disk cases or plastic trays specifically designed for storing collections. Some labeled their disks meticulously, dates, versions, contents, while others relied on cryptic abbreviations and memory. The save icon in most modern software is a 3.5-inch floppy disk. For many younger users today, this icon is purely symbolic. They've never touched a real floppy. But for those who lived through the era, the image carries sensory memory, the feel of the drive mechanism, the glow of the activity light, the soft mechanical noises of the read-write head seeking data. And while the 3.5-inch floppy improved on its predecessors in nearly every way, it still carried the limitations of its lineage. Storage space was limited. Files had to be split or compressed. Large projects might span multiple disks. Disk failures, while less frequent, still happened. Corrupted sectors could render precious files unreadable. But by and large, the 3.5-inch disk was reliable. In education, these disks played a foundational role. Computer labs in schools stocked them by the hundreds. Students carried a diskette with them for each subject or semester. Teachers handed out assignments and collected essays via floppy. Digital literacy was built, disk by disk. In the business world, the format supported everything from document sharing to internal software deployment. Disk duplication became a cottage industry. Companies kept copiers that could mass-produce disks overnight, each stamped with a serial number or barcode. Floppies were often used for customer service tools, inventory tracking, and internal training programs. In the arts and creative fields, the 3.5-inch disk was a bridge to digital workflows. Early music sequencers, MIDI tools, and graphics editors all supported floppy saving. Photographers and visual designers saved image files and project layouts. Writers drafted novels and scripts on word processors, then carried their progress home on a small plastic square. Despite its widespread adoption, the 3.5-inch disk faced challenges as files grew larger and systems more complex. Multimedia software, which included high-resolution images, audio, and video, quickly outpaced the format's modest storage capacity. CD-ROMs began appearing in the early 1990s, offering hundreds of megabytes in a single disk. But floppy disks didn't vanish overnight. They remained essential for bootable utilities, configuration files, and day-to-day storage needs. Technological limitations also gave rise to creative workarounds. Utilities like file splitters allowed users to break large files into smaller segments that fit across multiple disks. Installers were optimized for disk swapping. Compression tools such as PKZip and WinRAR became essential companions. The hardware, too, evolved. External drives connected via serial or USB ports. Laptops featured slide-in drives with spring-loaded mechanisms. Some machines offered dual-format compatibility, able to read both 720 KB and 1.44 MB disks. Entire workflows were built around disk capacity and organization. Eventually, even 3.5-inch floppies began to lose ground. The arrival of USB flash drives around the year 2000 changed everything, offering far greater capacity, speed, and durability in a similar physical size. They rapidly replaced floppies as the portable storage of choice. By the mid-2000s, many new computers shipped without floppy drives at all. Still, the 3.5-inch disk remained relevant in niche roles. Firmware updates, BIOS flashing tools, and recovery utilities were often distributed via floppy. In industries with long hardware lifespans, such as aerospace, healthcare, and manufacturing, systems designed around floppies remained in service for years. To this day, some specialized environments still rely on floppy disks for critical functions. The resilience and simplicity of the format make it ideal for machines where updates are rare, systems are isolated, and reliability trumps capacity. In retrospect, the 3.5-inch floppy represents a bridge between the analog charm of early computing and the modern convenience of digital life. It taught generations how to store, organize, and safeguard data. It lived in pockets, pencil cases, briefcases, and desk drawers. And though its time has passed, its legacy persists every time we click save. By the 1990s, floppy disks, especially the ubiquitous 3.5-inch format, had permeated nearly every corner of daily life. What began as an innovative solution to a technical problem had become an everyday object, one so integrated into personal and professional workflows that it was easy to overlook its significance. But in countless small ways, the floppy disk helped define the cultural experience of the digital age. In homes, the floppy disk was as common as a notepad. It sat beside the family computer, labeled and reused endlessly. A child might keep a disk for school assignments and another for saved games. Parents used them to store tax files, recipes, or early digital photographs. The disks themselves were tangible evidence of an increasingly digital life. You could hold your documents, your progress, even your memories in your hand. Many users began developing systems of personal organization. Some sorted disks alphabetically. Others used color coding, blue for school, red for games, black for work. Labeling became both a practical and creative act, carefully written titles, sometimes with stickers or even doodles. In a sense, the floppy was an early form of physical data curation. In schools, floppy disks became indispensable. Teachers distributed educational software, math drills, spelling games, simulations on floppies. Students submitted homework via disk, often in neatly labeled envelopes. Entire curricula were designed around floppy disk usage. Teachers would collect stacks of diskettes to review after class, offering feedback not in red ink, but with updated files saved back onto the student's disk. For many students, their first exposure to digital tools came through the floppy disk. It was the vessel through which they explored typing programs, early word processors, and simple programming languages like Logo or BASIC. Disk-based learning helped cultivate not just computer literacy, but a comfort with navigating files, saving progress, and respecting digital boundaries. In offices, floppy disks were everywhere. They facilitated document transfers between departments, backups of client records, and the storage of reports or invoices. Even after the advent of email and network storage, many professionals trusted floppies for critical data. After all, they were portable, dependable, and didn't rely on often unreliable office networks. Disk management became a task in itself. Administrative assistants curated libraries of disks for software, clients, and templates. Disk labels were printed with dot matrix precision. Protective cases were stocked in supply closets. And filing cabinets included drawers not just for paper, but for plastic rectangles of magnetized data. Marketing and advertising saw the floppy disk as an opportunity. Companies began using them for promotions, bundling floppies with product samples, mailing demo disks to prospective customers, or distributing catalogs on diskette. Magazines, especially in the tech and gaming sectors, frequently included cover disks with demos, software utilities, or even full applications. In these early years of software discovery, a floppy with a demo could introduce someone to a new game, a powerful spreadsheet tool, or a creative application. For many users, these tiny disks represented the gateway to new digital possibilities. Floppy disks also became symbols in popular culture. Movies portrayed spies and hackers transferring critical data on a disk. Television shows used them as visual shorthand for high-tech work. Even cartoons occasionally featured them, cementing their place in the cultural consciousness. The symbolic weight of the floppy extended beyond fiction. Its physical form was compact, humble, and practical. Unlike hard drives or servers, a floppy was something you could hand to a friend, slip into a book, or tape to a monitor. It embodied access, portability, and simplicity. In the realm of gaming, floppy disks were a shared currency. Friends swapped games, traded save files, and exchanged tips via diskette. Game manuals often included multiple disks, each one advancing the player further into an expansive digital world. Disk copying software flourished, as did the early culture of modding and game customization. Some games even pushed the limits of the format. Larger titles required 5, 10, or even 20 disks. Insert Disk 4 became a familiar prompt. Players learned patience. And for developers, disk limitation inspired creative compression, modular design, and efficient file management. In creative circles, floppy disks helped usher in digital expression. Early graphic design software, MIDI composition tools, and text editors relied on floppy-based workflows. Artists carried discs filled with rough drafts, layered image files, or melody sketches. The medium had changed, but the process, craft, revision, portability remained familiar. Personal memories were stored on floppy disks too. Early digital journals, family photos, birthday cards made with clip art, or school projects were all kept on labeled discs tucked in drawers. For many, there are still old diskettes in forgotten boxes, each one containing a frozen slice of life, a long-lost story, an elementary school science report, or a now inaccessible love letter. The act of using a floppy disk was also quietly meditative. You saved your work intentionally. You removed the disk gently. You stored it somewhere safe. The process had a rhythm to it, a sense of mindfulness. There was no cloud to sync automatically, no infinite storage. You chose what to save and where. This tactile relationship with data shaped early digital behaviors. People were more attuned to their files, aware of sizes, formats, and locations. Directory structures were memorized. File names were deliberate. It was a slower, more engaged form of computing. As internet access grew, the role of the floppy began to shift, but it didn't disappear. Early internet downloads were often transferred to floppy for use on non-network computers. Email attachments were saved to floppy for safekeeping. Some websites offered downloadable programs sized specifically to fit on a single 1.44 megabyte disk. Even with the rise of CD-ROMs, the floppy retained its foothold due to cost, compatibility, and familiarity. Many machines included both floppy and CD drives, allowing for a transitional period. Floppies were still faster for quick tasks, sharing a document, booting a utility, or transporting files across systems. By the late 1990s, more advanced formats began to overshadow the floppy, yet its cultural impact remained. The iconic look of the disk lived on in software icons, branding, and design metaphors. The phrase "save it to disk" lingered in speech long after disks were gone. Today, the floppy disk is a nostalgic object. It appears in retro-themed art, novelty earrings, and t-shirts. Museums display them as artifacts. Vintage tech collectors seek them out, preserving not just the hardware, but the memories contained within. The floppy disk's cultural legacy is more than just technological. It taught us about limits, about care, and about the relationship between humans and data. It gave us a way to hold memory in our hands, to organize our digital lives physically, and to connect through shared formats. So as we close this chapter, think of a cluttered desk in 1995. A child clicks save in Microsoft Works. A parent tucks a disk into a drawer. A teacher collects essays in labeled sleeves. All of them are participating in a quiet ritual, made possible by a small plastic square, spinning gently in the background of everyday life. By the turn of the millennium, the floppy disk was beginning to show its age. Although still widely used, the writing was on the wall. Files were getting larger. Software was becoming more complex. The humble floppy, with its 1.44 megabyte ceiling, could no longer keep pace with the evolving demands of the digital world. The decline didn't happen overnight. It was gradual, almost respectful, but it was inevitable. The seeds of this decline had already been planted in the 1990s. As software developers leaned into multimedia, even modest applications began to exceed what a single floppy could hold. Games with rich audio and colorful graphics required 10, 20, sometimes more disks to install. The act of swapping disks became a time-consuming ritual that tested users' patience. CD-ROMs soon emerged as a more viable alternative. First seen as a high-end novelty, they eventually became affordable and accessible. A single CD could store more than 450 times the capacity of a floppy disk. The leap in storage density was revolutionary. Software that previously required a stack of floppies could now be distributed on a single disk, complete with background music, video clips, and full-color graphics. Hardware followed suit. More desktop and laptop computers came equipped with CD-ROM drives. By the late 1990s, combo drives that handled both floppies and CDs became standard. It was a transitional period. Many users still relied on floppies for quick tasks, but CDs quickly took over for installations and data storage. Another major shift came with the rise of USB flash drives. Smaller than a pack of gum, yet capable of holding hundreds of megabytes and later gigabytes, these drives offered a new level of convenience. They were faster, rewritable, and could endure more physical stress. Floppy disks, once revered for their portability, suddenly felt fragile and cumbersome. The USB port itself became a nail in the floppy's coffin. As computers embraced USB connectivity, they no longer required built-in floppy drives. Manufacturers began phasing them out. New PCs shipped without them. Peripheral companies offered external USB floppy drives as a compromise, but their usage was limited to specific workflows or data recovery. Internet access also played a crucial role in the floppy's decline. As more users gained the ability to email files or download software directly from websites, the need for physical media diminished. Cloud storage, file transfer protocols, and even simple email attachments reduced reliance on disks. A 1.44 megabytes file, once considered substantial, was now smaller than a typical email signature graphic. Still, despite all of this, the floppy disk didn't vanish right away. It held on in certain corners of the computing world, sometimes out of necessity, other times out of tradition. Some institutions had legacy systems built around floppy disk workflows. Medical imaging machines, aerospace control systems, and industrial equipment continued using floppies simply because they worked, and updating the infrastructure was expensive or risky. Government and military operations were also slow to abandon the format. Reports emerged in the early 2000s of critical defense systems still using floppy disks to load launch codes or system checks. While this raised eyebrows in the media, the rationale was clear. The format was stable, isolated from network threats, and deeply embedded in long-standing protocols. Floppy disks found niche uses in the arts as well. Musicians experimented with the sound of floppy drives, programming them to sing by varying their read head movements. Visual artists used old disks as canvases for miniature paintings. The very obsolescence of the format inspired creativity. Retro computing communities, always passionate about preservation, began stockpiling floppies. They kept collections of classic software, archived drivers, and emulated environments. Some recreated full 1990s computing setups with working floppy drives and CRT monitors, both as hobby and homage. In classrooms and museums, floppy disks became artifacts. Educators used them to show students how storage had evolved. A disk was passed around, examined like a relic, its storage capacity laughed at but its impact respected. Exhibits displayed disks alongside cassette tapes and rotary phones, symbols of a not-so-distant past. Manufacturing of floppy disks slowed dramatically. Major producers like Sony and Verbatim cut production, yet demand lingered just enough that smaller companies continued supplying disks for industrial and archival use. These disks weren't cheap, they had become specialty items, but they served critical roles. Software developers began dropping support for floppy drives in their programs. BIOS update utilities, once distributed via floppy, moved to USB and online methods. Operating systems no longer included default drivers for floppy controllers. By the mid-2000s, the era of native floppy compatibility was clearly ending. One by one, the pieces fell away. Retail shelves no longer stocked boxes of floppies. School supply lists stopped including them. Office drawers were cleared out, old disks thrown away or stored in boxes labeled obsolete. An entire generation who once organized their digital lives by tiny labels now watched as the format faded into memory. Yet even as the floppy declined, it remained strangely persistent. It outlasted other transitional media like zip disks, mini disks, and even some early optical formats. Its longevity wasn't just a testament to design, it was about timing, convenience, and widespread adoption. Its death wasn't sudden, it was quiet, like a system powering down. There was no dramatic farewell, just a gradual migration to other tools, newer symbols, different habits. People stopped reaching for floppies not because they were bad, but because they had outgrown them. By the 2010s, only a few industries still used them. Floppy drives were rare. Floppy disk references began to feel anachronistic, and yet the save icon remained. The physical object had faded, but its cultural imprint endured. So as we close this segment, imagine a desk in 2003. A computer whirs softly, its floppy drive empty. A stack of unused disks gathers dust in a drawer. A young professional now saves files to a USB stick. A teenager uploads homework to cloud storage. A system update arrives via email, not mail. The era of the floppy wasn't over in a flash. It ended slowly, gently, with barely a sound. And that quiet fade is perhaps the most fitting farewell for a technology that never sought the spotlight, but served faithfully in the background. Even as the floppy disk faded from everyday use, its legacy remained deeply etched into the collective consciousness of the digital age. It was no longer a practical tool, but a symbol, a reminder of the early, tactile days of computing, a quiet monument to the era when data had a shape, a sound, and a slot it slid into. Perhaps the most enduring representation of the floppy disk's cultural afterlife is the familiar save icon. In nearly every software interface, be it a word processor, a spreadsheet tool, or a design program, that small square image with a notch and a shutter signifies safety. It signals preservation. Even users who have never seen a real floppy disk understand what the icon means. Its function has outlived its form, but the floppy's legacy extends beyond visual metaphors. It taught generations the fundamentals of digital responsibility. You had to name your files, manage their locations, track versions, and back them up. These behaviors became habits, and those habits formed the basis of modern file management practices. In a world of autosave and infinite storage, the floppy era required awareness, intention, and patience. Technologically, the floppy disk's lineage can be traced in every portable storage format that followed. USB flash drives, external hard drives, SD cards. They all offer what the floppy first introduced to a mass audience: personal, mobile, rewritable storage. The idea that you could carry your data with you, store it independently of a central system, and move it freely from one machine to another, that was radical once. Now it's expected. There's a kind of quiet dignity in how the floppy bowed out. It didn't resist change. It didn't cling to relevance. It simply faded as the world outpaced it. But in doing so, it left behind a legacy of simplicity. A reminder that sometimes good design means doing one thing well. The floppy didn't promise speed, capacity, or longevity. It promised access. And for a time, that promise was everything. In retro computing circles, floppies still spin. Hobbyists run vintage machines, archive old software, and even produce new programs that fit within the constraints of a floppy disk. These communities view floppies not as outdated tools, but as canvases for creativity and historical preservation. There's something meditative in the process, writing to disk, labeling it, inserting it into a drive, a return to slower rhythms. In museums, floppies now sit in glass cases preserved alongside slide rules, punch cards, and analog telephones. Visitors point and reminisce. I used those in college. That's how I saved my first story. Can you believe we used to fit entire programs on that? The floppy disk becomes a conversation starter, a memory trigger, a tangible link to the past. Even in modern media, the image of the floppy disk persists. It's seen in TV shows and films as shorthand for the past. A prop in a detective's drawer, a relic in a hacker's toolkit, a clue in a mystery. It's instantly recognizable, even to those born long after its prime. Its shape, its texture, its sound, they're part of the cultural lexicon. Designers and artists continue to incorporate floppy disks into their work. Some create sculptures from stacked disks, others paint detailed portraits on their surfaces. Jewelry makers turn floppies into earrings or pendants. For some, it's nostalgia. For others, it's admiration for the format's minimalism and clarity. And in the corporate world, long after the last floppy drive was manufactured, some institutions still rely on systems originally built around floppy disks. Airplanes with decades-long service lives, industrial machinery programmed with legacy tools, secure government protocols that never required an upgrade. The floppy disk, despite its retirement, still quietly performs its duty. Its simplicity became its strength. Floppies didn't need special permissions, subscriptions, or passwords. They were plug-and-play, self-contained, and easy to understand. You inserted a disk, you read or wrote data, and you removed it. No hidden background processes, no data tracking, no bloat. That purity has become increasingly rare in a world of cloud syncing, remote servers, and algorithmic oversight. In retrospect, the floppy disk represents a kind of digital innocence, a time when users were more hands-on, more engaged with their data, more aware of what it meant to save, to store, to share. The floppy disk also lives on in language. Phrases like floppy drive, disk error, or even save it to disk persist in speech. They're echoes of a time when computing was simpler, more deliberate. These remnants may fade slowly, but their presence is proof of how deeply the floppy influenced our digital habits. Looking back, it's easy to chuckle at the limitations. A single photo from a modern smartphone would fill multiple disks. Streaming a movie would require thousands. But the floppy was never about more. It was about just enough. It introduced millions to the idea that information could be stored, retrieved, and reused. That alone changed everything. So as we bring this story to a close, picture one last scene. A person sits at an old beige desktop. They finish typing a document. Their hand reaches to insert a blue 3.5-inch disk. The drive clicks. The activity light glows softly. The file is saved. There's a moment of quiet. A small, satisfying hum. And then, just like that, the disk is ejected. Mission complete. The floppy disk may no longer spin in your machine, but it spins still in memory. Not as a relic, but as a reminder that technology at its best isn't about power or prestige. It's about utility, connection, simplicity, and sometimes a square piece of plastic with a magnetic heart is all it takes to change the world. Thank you for joining me on this quiet journey through the history of the floppy disk. In many ways, it's hard to believe how something so small, so unassuming, once played such a central role in our digital lives. It sat beside us on desks, traveled in backpacks, and clicked gently into machines with the promise of holding our words, our work, and our creativity. In revisiting the floppy story, we're not just recounting the rise and fall of a storage device, we're reflecting on an era. One where data felt tangible, where computing invited care and attention, and where saving a file meant taking a moment to think, to choose, and to preserve. There's a kind of warmth in remembering those days. Whether you were typing essays in a dorm room, cataloging photos at the office, or swapping game discs with a friend, the floppy was more than a tool. It was a companion in your early steps into the digital world. Its gentle whirring was a soundtrack to those moments of discovery, productivity, and sometimes frustration. And over time, it became a quiet teacher, helping us develop habits that remain with us today. The story of the floppy disk is also the story of adaptation. It weathered decades of innovation, quietly evolving from 8 inches to 5.25, then to 3.5, never asking for attention, never demanding praise. It simply served. And when it had done all it could, it stepped aside gracefully, leaving behind not just artifacts, but influence. In today's world of cloud drives, invisible syncing, and endless data streams, the floppy disk reminds us of a slower rhythm, one where technology felt more grounded, more physical, more human. There was a ceremony to it, labeling a disk, inserting it, hearing that soft click, a moment of connection between you and the machine. Perhaps that's why it continues to resonate. Not because it's still useful, but because it was meaningful. It represents a bridge between generations, those who remember and those who are curious. And in that bridge lies something timeless, the power of simple ideas to change how we live, work, and think. So wherever you are, listening while working, relaxing, or drifting into sleep, I hope this reflection has brought a sense of calm, a hint of nostalgia, and maybe even a deeper appreciation for how far we've come. Because while the floppy disk may be gone from our desks, it's never really left us. It lives on in the way we name our files, in the icons we click, in the way we instinctively hit save. It lives on in our habits, our memories, and our stories. And now, as we close the lid on this soft spinning chapter of tech history, let it rest gently, quiet, a magnetic soul that once held our thoughts and still holds our hearts. Until next time, thank you for listening. Sleep well.